They murdered without mercy, tortured their victims in ways too gruesome to forget. And when justice caught up with them, they faced their fate in a Texas death chamber, some defiant, some broken. In this video, we uncover the most brutal prisoners ever executed in Texas, their horrifying crimes, their final meals, and the last chilling words they spoke before everything went silent. No one leaves this video without chills. If you're fascinated by the shocking truths behind capital punishment, subscribe now and hit the notification bell. Join our true crime community as we uncover stories the world was never meant to forget. Angel Maturino Resendez. In the shadows of America's railroads, a drifter brought terror to towns across the southern United States. His name was Angel Maturino Resendez, but the world would come to know him as the Railroad Killer, a nickname as chilling as the trail of bodies he left behind. Born in Mexico in 1960, Resendez exploited the vast, unguarded network of U.S. railroads to move undetected between states. He hopped freight trains like a ghost, slipping through the cracks of immigration and law enforcement systems. What made his crimes even more terrifying was the randomness. He didn't know his victims, and they didn't know what was coming. Between 1997 and 1999, Resendez committed a string of brutal murders, primarily in Texas, but also in Illinois, Florida, Kentucky, and Georgia. He often broke into homes near train tracks, attacking residents while they slept. His weapon of choice? A hammer, a pickaxe, or anything heavy and close at hand. He bludgeoned his victims, men and women, young and old, with unrelenting force, leaving behind crime scenes soaked in horror. Some victims were sexually assaulted. Many were found with their heads caved in or their faces mutilated beyond recognition. The FBI placed Resendez on their 10 most wanted fugitives list in 1999, and a nationwide manhunt was launched. His ability to vanish by hopping freight trains made him elusive, but the terror couldn't last forever. In a rare twist, it was Resendez's own sister who ultimately helped bring him in. Fearing for public safety and her brother's soul, she persuaded him to surrender to authorities in El Paso, Texas, on July 13, 1999. During his trial, Resendez claimed to be half human, half angel. He spoke of divine forces, demonic control, and spiritual visions. Despite concerns about his mental state, he was found competent to stand trial. In 2000, he was convicted of the 1998 murder of Dr. Claudia Benton, a Houston area researcher whom he beat, raped, and stabbed before stealing her car and fleeing. Though he was suspected in at least 15 murders, it was Benton's case that sealed his fate. On June 27, 2006, after nearly 7 years on death row, Angel Resendez was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. He declined a special last meal, receiving the standard prison fare instead. As he lay strapped to the gurney, his final words were quiet, remorseful, and deeply unsettling. "I want to ask if it is in your heart to forgive me." "You don't have to. I know I allowed the devil to rule my life." At 8:05 p.m., he was pronounced dead. His story remains one of the most haunting in Texas criminal history, not only for the viciousness of his crimes, but for the eerie transience of his method. He moved like smoke through towns, sleeping in train yards and riding steel giants from one scene of horror to the next. Even now, those who lived along the tracks remember the unease that gripped their communities, the fear that a stranger might be watching, waiting just beyond the rails. Johnny Frank Garrett. In the early hours of October 31st, 1981, a crime shocked the quiet town of Amarillo, Texas. Sister Tadea Benz, a 76-year-old Catholic nun, was found raped, strangled, and mutilated in her room at the St. Francis Convent. The brutality of the murder outraged the community, and authorities were under pressure to find the killer fast. Just days later, 17-year-old Johnny Frank Garrett was arrested. Garrett lived across the street from the convent and had a troubled background. He was a diagnosed schizophrenic, had suffered years of sexual and physical abuse, and reportedly exhibited signs of severe mental illness. Yet despite no direct eyewitnesses, questionable forensic evidence, and a hurried investigation, he was charged, convicted, and sentenced to death in 1982. But it wasn't just the speed of the trial that raised alarms, it was the handling of the evidence. Later analyses, including in the 2008 documentary The Last Word, suggested potential DNA mismatches, unsubmitted evidence that could have exonerated Garrett, and the confession of another man to a strikingly similar murder, never fully investigated. Throughout his time on death row, Garrett maintained his innocence. Even a clemency request, supported by international human rights advocates and the Vatican, failed to sway then-Governor Ann Richards, who allowed the execution to proceed. On February 11, 1992, Garrett was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. He was just 28 years old. He requested ice cream for his last meal. As he lay on the gurney, strapped in and surrounded by witnesses, his final words cut like a blade. "I'd like to thank my family for loving me and taking care of me, and the rest of the world can kiss my ass." To this day, his case remains one of the most controversial executions in Texas history. Whether Johnny Frank Garrett was a monster or a victim of a deeply flawed justice system may never be fully known, but the haunting legacy of his execution continues to spark debate over the irrevocability of the death penalty and the fallibility of those who enforce it. Kimberly McCarthy. On July 21, 1997, in the Dallas suburb of Lancaster, Texas, 71-year-old retired psychology professor Dorothy Booth answered a knock at her door. Standing there was her neighbor, Kimberly McCarthy, a former nurse who claimed she needed to borrow some sugar. What followed was a calculated and brutal murder that stunned the local community and eventually landed McCarthy on Texas death row. Once inside the home, McCarthy attacked Booth with a large butcher knife, stabbing her 5 times, beating her with a candelabra, and ultimately cutting off her left ring finger to steal her diamond wedding ring. She then took Booth's credit cards, wallet, and car, which she used to purchase crack cocaine and liquor. The crime scene was horrific. Booth was found with deep gashes to her face and neck, her home ransacked, and evidence pointing directly to McCarthy. Forensics matched fingerprints, and Booth's missing items were recovered in McCarthy's possession. But Dorothy Booth's murder was not McCarthy's only suspected killing. Authorities later linked her to 2 additional murders from the early 1980s, both elderly women, both killed in strikingly similar ways. Though she was never tried for those cases, the pattern of violence painted a disturbing portrait. A woman who targeted the vulnerable for personal gain and whose descent into addiction left a trail of blood in its wake. McCarthy was convicted in 1998 and sentenced to death. Over the years, she filed numerous appeals, citing ineffective counsel and racial bias in jury selection, since she was African American and convicted by a nearly all-white jury. Her case gained attention from anti-death penalty activists and civil rights groups, but none of the appeals were successful. On June 26, 2013, Kimberly McCarthy was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. She was 52 years old. She declined a special last meal and was given standard prison food. As the drugs coursed through her veins, McCarthy's final words echoed with conviction and faith. "This is not a loss. This is a win. You know where I'm going." With her death, McCarthy became the 500th person executed in Texas since the state resumed capital punishment in 1982, a grim milestone in Texas history. Her execution marked the end of a violent chapter, but also reignited debates over race, justice, and redemption inside the walls of death row. Lawrence Russell Brewer. On the night of June 7, 1998, in the small town of Jasper, Texas, one of the most heinous hate crimes in American history unfolded. James Byrd Jr., a 49-year-old black man, accepted a ride home from 3 white men. Instead of taking him home, they beat him savagely, chained him by the ankles to the back of a pickup truck, and dragged him for over 3 miles down a secluded asphalt road. By the time the truck stopped, Byrd's body had been torn apart, his head and right arm severed. The motive was chillingly clear: pure racial hatred. One of the 3 men responsible was Lawrence Russell Brewer, a self-proclaimed white supremacist and former prison gang member. Alongside accomplices John King and Sean Berry, Brewer helped orchestrate this act of racial terror, which sparked national outrage and became a catalyst for modern hate crime legislation. Brewer was arrested, tried, and convicted of capital murder. Prosecutors introduced evidence that he had white supremacist tattoos, including Nazi insignia and KKK symbols, and had expressed no remorse. His behavior behind bars, according to prison staff, only reinforced his ideology. On September 21, 2011, after 13 years on death row, Lawrence Russell Brewer was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. But what happened just before his execution drew nearly as much attention as the crime itself. For his last meal, Brewer requested a feast: 2 chicken fried steaks with gravy, a triple meat bacon cheeseburger, a cheese omelet, fried okra, a pound of barbecue with half a loaf of white bread, a meat lover's pizza, 3 root beers, ice cream, and a slab of peanut butter fudge with crushed peanuts. Then he refused to eat any of it. The public backlash was swift. In response, Texas officials, outraged at what they viewed as a mockery of the system, abolished the last meal tradition entirely. Inmates in Texas now receive whatever is being served in the prison cafeteria, no exceptions. As he lay on the execution gurney, Brewer's final words stunned many. As far as any regrets, no. I have no regrets. He was pronounced dead at 6:21 p.m. Lawrence Brewer's execution was more than the end of a life. It marked the end of a Texas tradition, the height of public disgust, and a lasting symbol of the ugly face of racism in America. The murder of James Byrd Jr. led directly to the James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act, signed into federal law in 2009, ensuring that this horrific crime would leave a legacy of justice behind its trail of horror. Kenneth McDuff. In the annals of Texas criminal history, few names inspire more fear and outrage than Kenneth Allen McDuff, a man whose crimes were so savage and whose case so controversial it reshaped the parole system in Texas forever. In 1966, McDuff was just 19 when he and an accomplice committed what became known as the Broomstick Murders. They abducted 3 teenagers, 2 boys and 1 girl, at gunpoint near Fort Worth. The boys, Robert Brand and his cousin Edna Sullivan's boyfriend, were shot dead in cold blood. The girl, Edna Louise Sullivan, just 16, was raped, strangled, and brutally murdered. McDuff used the broken shaft of a broomstick to crush her throat, a detail so gruesome it earned him his lasting nickname, the Broomstick Killer. He was sentenced to death, but the 1972 U.S. Supreme Court ruling in Furman v. Georgia struck down the death penalty nationwide, leading to McDuff's sentence being commuted to life in prison. In a shocking turn, he was paroled in 1989, thanks to overcrowding and a deeply flawed parole system that viewed him as rehabilitated. What followed was a new wave of unspeakable violence. Between 1989 and 1992, McDuff targeted sex workers, drug users, and drifters across central Texas. His victims were typically young women who vanished from truck stops or dimly lit parking lots, only to be found later in fields, ditches, or remote rural areas, raped, tortured, and murdered. Some were strangled. Others were tied up or beaten. McDuff's MO was brutal and personal, often involving physical domination and mental terror. In 1992, McDuff was finally arrested again after a nationwide manhunt. His story became national news. A paroled death row inmate who went on a killing spree right under the noses of the justice system. The fallout was immense. Texas lawmakers were forced to overhaul parole laws, severely limiting the possibility of violent offenders ever being released again. In 1998, after years on death row for the murder of 22-year-old Melissa Ann Northrup, a woman he abducted from the convenience store where she worked, Kenneth McDuff was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. For his last meal, McDuff requested a hamburger and French fries, a strangely ordinary choice for someone whose crimes were anything but. As he lay on the gurney, strapped down and moments from death, his final words were, "I'm ready to be released. Release me." And with that, one of America's most terrifying serial killers was gone. McDuff remains one of the only known death row inmates in modern U.S. history to be released, only to kill again and again. His case has become a textbook example of how deadly the consequences of a broken justice system can be. These stories from Texas death row reveal the darkest sides of humanity and the chilling silence that follows. Their crimes were savage, their executions final, but their last meals and words, those are the fragments they left behind, echoing in the public record as reminders of justice or its complicated cost. Which story left you stunned? Tell us in the comments below. And if you want more true crime deep dives, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on that notification bell. We've got more haunting stories just around the corner. Thanks for watching. Stay safe, stay curious, and remember, the past doesn't forget.